Hey guys, tonight we're setting the big philosophical questions aside in favor of something more down to earth, the food that was actually served in the saloons of the Wild West. These establishments earned their reputations on whiskey, fistfights, and piano playing of debatable quality. But what ended up on the plates? Was the menu really nothing but bacon and beans, or did a few surprises wait behind those swinging doors? Before we dig in, if you enjoy what I do here, and only if you honestly do, consider leaving a like and subscribing, and tell me in the comments which corner of the world you're listening from and what the clock says there. Seeing how far these videos travel never stops being interesting to me. The very first thing to greet a person stepping through a saloon's doors wasn't the piano, and it wasn't the sound of some poor soul dropping a week's pay at the card table. It was the smell. Set aside the romantic image of steak on a grill and cornbread fresh from the oven. What actually hit the nose was closer to an assault, a layered mixture of unwashed cowboys, damp tobacco, stale beer, wet timber, horses that hadn't seen water in 10 years, and, on a good day, the faint suggestion that something was cooking in the back. A few establishments fought back with sawdust scattered across the floorboards, or pipe smoke dense enough to cause short-term memory loss. Others simply accepted it. "You don't come here for the air," a barkeep might announce while swatting flies off the counter with a rag that hadn't been washed since the Civil War. And yet a kitchen always existed somewhere. Sometimes it was nothing more than a fire pit in a back corner with a pan of beans simmering over the coals. Sometimes it was an ill-tempered woman in a soot-blackened apron stirring an unidentifiable stew with a spoon that served double duty as a weapon of self-defense. But food was happening somewhere on the premises, and if its aroma managed to cut through the sweat and the whiskey fumes, dinner was already half won. Provided, of course, that a seat could be found. Saloons weren't arranged the way modern restaurants are. There were no waiters, no menus printed in elegant lettering, only a handful of splintered tables, chairs of questionable stability, and one long counter where a man could eat, drink, and quarrel, sometimes all three within the same minute. Regulars got the short version. The cook would holler, "beans" or "stew," and the answer came back without anyone raising their eyes. Strangers new to town got a long, appraising stare instead, while everyone tried to calculate whether this one would settle his bill or collapse before the plate even arrived. And that, in its way, is what made eating in a saloon remarkable. It had nothing to do with flavor and everything to do with staying alive. You ate whatever happened to be on hand, not what you would have chosen. You shared a bench with strangers who might pick your pocket tonight or pull you out of trouble tomorrow. And if the meal disagreed with you, whiskey existed for precisely that reason. At the very top of the Wild West food chain sat the humble bean. Not for its taste, but because it was cheap, practically indestructible, and capable of riding out an apocalypse, a shootout, and a cattle stampede without so much as flinching. Pinto, black, navy. The variety hardly mattered. Anything dry, more or less edible, and willing to be boiled into surrender went into the pot. Beans were the quiet workhorses of every saloon kitchen, dished out at breakfast, midday, and night, frequently to men who hadn't laid eyes on a vegetable since leaving Kansas behind. The recipe demanded little. Step 1. Empty the beans into a pot. Step 2. Boil them for 6 hours above a fire of dubious reliability. Step 3. Serve alongside salt pork, a biscuit past its prime, and an expression of gentle apology. The more ambitious cooks might stir in lard, some onion, even a pinch of chili powder on adventurous days, but most never troubled themselves. Out west, flavor counted as an extravagance, and the seasoning amounted to whatever the wind carried through an open window. What beans offered was heartiness, fullness, and predictability. Three qualities a cowboy prized above gold itself. They powered the long cattle drives, kept poker games running into the night, and gave a man something to work his jaw on while waiting for the piano to start up again, or for somebody to exit through the front window. There was only one drawback: the aftermath. A single cowboy on a bean diet could be endured. 10 of them under one roof amounted to a biological weapon. The story goes that certain bar fights began not with an insult but with one silent, deadly betrayal somewhere near the stove. Still, dependability counted for something. When the meat was gone, when the chickens had made their escape, when the cook was down to his last 7 brain cells courtesy of the whiskey fumes, the beans endured, unbothered, unburnt, unchanged. Some cowboys actually preferred them. They could be eaten cold, warmed up over and over, and even traded as improvised currency when times got tight. Legend tells of a man who purchased a horse for 3 pounds of salted beans and a solemn promise never to come back. So yes, saloon cooking had its peaks and its valleys, but beans were the constant, the foundation, the modest pulse beating beneath 1,000 dusty suppers. Nobody loved them. Everybody respected them. Some nights, that was plenty. If beans were the soul of saloon cooking, salt pork was its backbone, a somewhat greasier one. Here was a slab of fat and muscle, tough enough to outlast a thunderstorm, a barroom brawl, and half a year in a saddlebag without altering its texture in the slightest. Salt pork was not bacon, however much cowboys enjoyed pretending otherwise. It was pork belly, cured under heavy salt and frequently smoked, stored in barrels of brine concentrated enough to season a small ocean. The salt was what kept it from spoiling, and, some would argue, from being food at all. Prepared properly, it was tolerable. Fried in a hot skillet until crisp and sizzling, it delivered flavor, grease, and a crunch, satisfying enough to briefly erase the memory that the rest of the meal had come out of a can. Prepared badly, which was the usual outcome, it resembled a salted boot heel with a coating of axle grease. Even so, the stuff had loyal admirers. It travelled well, resisted ruin despite many earnest attempts, and lent the dullest pot of beans a small salty jolt of happiness. Or at minimum, another excuse to order whiskey. Saloon cooks let nothing go to waste. The rendered fat fried everything from potatoes to biscuit dough. The rind went into stew pots, to the dogs, or onto the plates of newcomers who hadn't yet learned the difference. One bite taught them fast, and they'd discover the barkeep meant every word of chew slow or choke proud. Was the pork occasionally suspect? Certainly. A greenish shimmer here, an odour there that raised questions. But saloon philosophy never asked, is it fresh? The operative question was, did it kill the last guy? If the answer was no, you took your chances. Versatility was another point in its favour. Salt pork could be cubed into beans, laid across a biscuit, fried on its own, or worried at like jerky across a long day's ride. Cowboys hoarded it like treasure, and saloon cooks fell back on it whenever the chickens went missing or the stew grew thin. It was never elegant and certainly never healthy, but in a country where the next hot meal might sit 60 miles down the trail, salt pork did its job. And a man who survived it came out tougher on the other side. Stew, meanwhile, was the frontier's great equalizer. Hot, approximately meat-based, and thoroughly suspicious. Nearly every saloon offered it, no matter how derelict the kitchen, and for a simple reason, Stew was the perfect alibi for whatever scraps the cook had on hand or couldn't lawfully identify. The foundation required only a pot, a flame, and a certain optimism. Water first, perhaps beans or potatoes, and then anything that hadn't managed to walk off. Beef, naturally. Rabbit, without question. Squirrel? Of course. Rattlesnake? If it had stopped biting, in it went. One traveller swore he fished a bootlace out of his bowl, and didn't even complain, since it was the most chewable thing in there. The meat itself ran the full spectrum. Some pots held tender cuts of beef from the town butcher, others held meat, full stop, the kind about which questions were not asked. If the cook seemed jumpy and the local dog count had recently dropped, the wise diner ate around the chewier pieces and offered up a quiet prayer. Vegetables, when they appeared at all, were boiled past recognition. Carrots dissolved into orange smears. Onions vanished without a trace. Potatoes put up the longest fight before surrendering like the rest. The finished product was a bubbling grey-brown slurry that smelled considerably better than it looked and tasted better than anyone expected, given sufficient salt. Spices were a rare indulgence. Most stews drew their character from whatever clung to the cook's knife or knuckles. Black pepper meant you had wandered into a high-class establishment. Chili powder meant congratulations, your sinuses were about to be cleared by force. Yet for all the mystery, stew was what passed for comfort on the frontier. It was hot, it filled the belly, and it could be extended indefinitely by the simple addition of water. One pot might serve a dozen men, or be revived, 3 days running until it took on the texture and the personality of old glue. Nobody ate stew for the pleasure of it. They ate it because it existed, because it was warm, and because nothing else in town qualified as food unless chewing tobacco and regret counted. The single rule, never ask what went into it. On the frontier, ignorance wasn't merely bliss, it was supper. Not every cowboy had state money, but nearly every saloon kept something bred, adjacent around for soaking up the stew. It came in one of two forms: soft, flaky biscuits, a small miracle when fresh, or hardtack, which was essentially bread's undead relative. Biscuits first. Done properly, which was uncommon but magical, they emerged warm, buttery and flaky enough to make a man believe he had stumbled into a real kitchen. A cook who could turn out a good biscuit became a local celebrity. Some credited lard for the secret, others swore by buttermilk. A few, in all likelihood, simply possessed lucky hands and modest standards. Biscuits did their finest work beside beans or stew, mopping up whatever broth hadn't already scalded a tongue. They were usually baked in cast iron over open flame and arrived with a chunk of butter of uncertain provenance, or, in the finer establishments, a splash of molasses. Then there was hardtack, flour and water baked into a slab capable of surviving nuclear winter. Originally devised for soldiers and sailors, it drifted westward on the strength of a single virtue. It never went bad. It also only barely qualified as food. Eating it required a plan of attack. First came the weevil inspection, not grounds for rejection, merely bonus crunch. Next came the soak, in stew, coffee or whiskey, a process that could run anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 presidential terms. And even softened, chewing hardtack remained a serious commitment. You didn't so much eat it as wrestle with it. Dentists likely turned a tidy profit on cowboys who challenged a piece and came out the loser. Here is the thing, though, both the biscuit and the hardtack earned their keep. They cost little, they travelled anywhere, they filled the stomach. And in a world where calories mattered far more than cuisine, that was all anyone required. So, if you strolled into some dusty saloon and found a plate of steaming biscuits waiting, you counted your blessings. And if they handed you a hardtack puck the size of your palm instead, well, at least it came with a story and possibly a chipped tooth. Cowboy coffee makes even the strongest modern espresso look timid. This was a brew with attitude. It didn't simply wake a man up. It looked him in the eye and waited for him to flinch. Out on the frontier, coffee had almost nothing to do with flavor and nearly everything to do with staying upright. Nobody roasted beans by region, nobody owned clever filtering gadgets, and nobody was decorating a cup with oat milk foam art. The beans were crushed carelessly, sometimes not crushed at all, tipped into a kettle, and boiled until the liquid went black and seemed faintly alive. The recipe, such as it was, ran along these lines. Fetch water from whatever source presented itself, ideally not downstream of the horses. Add a fistful of grounds, the amount decided by gut feeling and hostility. Boil it fiercely. Strain nothing. Question nothing. Pour it out and hope. What emerged was a thick, dark liquid that smelled like scorched dreams and tasted like revenge. It was perfectly normal for the final swallow to hold more grounds than coffee, meaning a cowboy took in his caffeine and his fiber together in one brave gulp, and still they adored the stuff. Coffee warmed you through freezing desert dawns. It carried you through the night watch. It covered hangovers and helped settle stews of doubtful origin. In a single tin cup, it managed to be fuel, comfort, and penance all at once. A saloon only offered coffee if it had a kitchen, but where it did, the coffee arrived scalding, probably ancient, and strong enough to peel paint off a wall. One cowboy compared it to swallowing a kick from a mule, the kind of thing you missed once it was gone. The refined might stir in sugar or canned milk when such things could be had. Everybody else winced and kept drinking. And when a saloon had been warming the same pot since morning, you received the mightiest brew mankind ever produced, dense as tar and twice as bitter about its circumstances. Some cooks, it should be said, ran old grounds through a second time to make the pot last. That thrift produced coffee with the flavor of disappointment and regret, but it still qualified. Out west, nobody drank coffee for the pleasure of it. You drank it to feel alive and to go on feeling that way. Meat in the Wild West was never merely dinner. It functioned as money, as social rank, and now and then as a dare. A man with cash in his pocket could stroll into a saloon and ask for steak. What landed in front of him depended on fortune, on timing, and on whether the cook had decided he disliked the man's face. On paper, steak was a luxury item. On the plate, it was usually a leathery, thoroughly overcooked piece of beef, fried in a pan of lard, blackened until it surrendered, and delivered with precisely no garnish whatsoever. Request it medium rare, and the cook would simply hold your gaze until your moustache lost its will to live. When fresh beef couldn't be had, which, honestly, was most of the time, a saloon fell back on other options: dried jerky, salted buffalo, the occasional venison, even wild boar when somebody's hunt went well. And went well here meant hitting the animal and hauling it home before the buzzards state their claim. In mining towns and remote settlements, the meat situation grew more inventive still: squirrel stew, roasted rattlesnake, jackrabbit cooked with seasoning. Anything with legs qualified, provided those legs didn't belong to a paying customer's horse. Sometimes meat arrived without a name, and nobody volunteered one. That was the signal to eat quietly and keep your curiosity to yourself. If a bite took too long to chew, or something suspiciously like a whisker surfaced, the protocol was a sip of whiskey, a solemn nod, and quiet acceptance of your fate. Then there was the matter of age. Certain cuts had been hanging around long enough to deserve names of their own. A cook would trim away the worst sections, bury the remainder in gravy, and describe the result as well-aged. Should your dinner twitch when prodded, you were entitled to one raised eyebrow and not a syllable more. Even so, when the beef was fresh and the cook wasn't drunk, a genuine meal was possible. A sizzling cut of beef, a fried egg laid across the top, perhaps a biscuit riding alongside. The sort of plate that explained why men bothered surviving gunfights. Most of the time, though, you ate whatever existed and hoped it wouldn't return the favour. Dessert, in a Wild West saloon, wasn't really a category of its own. It was closer to a fortunate accident. What happened when a cook found spare ingredients and located a small sliver of mercy? But if any sweet-leaning comfort could be counted on, it was cornbread, plain cornmeal, water or milk, lard, and, when the cook thought of it, a dash of baking powder. It could be baked in pans, fried in skillets, or, when someone was rushed or simply lazy, dropped by the spoonful straight into boiling stew. On its own it was dry, crumbly, and faintly sweet, depending on whose hands made it, and it was best eaten fresh, which is to say it almost never was. What you usually received was a wedge that had been parked beside the stove since sunrise, gone hard as a miner's conscience. The transformation came with molasses, a dark, sticky, syrupy miracle that lifted dry cornbread to within arm's reach of glory. Molasses was frosting for the cowboy, drizzle for the outlaw, and a final scrap of joy for the lonely gambler before a bad hand took everything else. It cost little, kept well in the heat, and forgave the sins of even the most parched baking. A saloon with a barrel of the stuff was a lucky find. A saloon that warmed it before pouring was, by frontier arithmetic, practically a 5-star house. Certain cooks went a step beyond, dousing skillet-fried cornbread in molasses and adding a small pinch of salt or spice. It wasn't quite cake, but after a week of chewing jerky and hardtack, it could impersonate cake convincingly. And so cornbread with molasses settled in as the default dessert, fast, cheap, filling, and just sweet enough to steady the nerves after a hard ride or a narrow moment in the poker room. No icing, no whipped cream, nothing ornamental, just grit, grain, and a sticky kind of satisfaction. For a great many people that was plenty. When daily life ran to cattle drives, dust storms, and the occasional shootout, dessert was under no obligation to sparkle. It only had to prove that not everything out west was trying to kill you. Anyone who managed to wander into a saloon before noon, sober, preferably, and not bleeding, might be offered eggs and chicken. That offer was either a miracle or a trap, and it took experience to tell which. Begin with the eggs. A fresh egg on the frontier was gold. Not literal gold, but nearly as scarce and every bit as fragile. Chickens were not kept for amusement. They were bad-tempered, inclined to wander, and routinely stolen, eaten, or surrendered to foxes. A saloon with eggs in stock either kept its own birds, knew a supplier nearby, or ran a quiet smuggling arrangement with the next town over. What sort of eggs were they? Chicken, with luck. Duck, possibly. Something else entirely, on occasion. and one learned not to inquire. You asked for eggs, and what appeared was governed by the cook's temper and the egg's birthday. Some came scrambled, which conveniently hid the colour. Others were fried until the yolks resembled leather. And if the thing wobbled as it met your plate, the universe was suggesting you order whiskey instead. Chicken itself did appear on menus, though not often. Where a board promised fried chicken, the likely reality was a scrawny bird that had died in a foul temper, stringy, bony, and fried in lard until the flavour gave up entirely. It wasn't always worth the jaw work. But it was meat. It was hot. And above all, it was not beans again, so people ate it with gratitude. The portion might be a drumstick the size of a thumb, or a whole quarter turned over an open flame. It might also arrive with a feather in the gravy, which counted as part of the charm. Offering eggs and chicken at breakfast was a badge of standing for a saloon, a way of announcing that its food came from neither a can nor a barrel. If the eggs arrived warm and the chicken hadn't dried out, you'd be telling your friends about it for weeks. If the meal poisoned you instead, that was merely the West clarifying who was actually in charge. Even so, an order of eggs carried a certain optimism. Eggs meant morning. Eggs meant survival. And with a little luck, they meant you'd still be standing. Come nightfall, ready to drink again. Pie, in a Wild West saloon, was less a dessert than a declaration. A pie resting on the bar, steam curling upward, crust gone golden, the scent of apples threading through the smoke and whiskey, announced that this establishment took itself seriously. It also proved that somebody in the kitchen had made a genuine effort, which, in a country of bean slop and overcooked pork, amounted to a love letter. Expectations needed managing, though. Frontier pie was no flawless lattice-topped pastry piled with orchard fruit. It was a rough, homely production, crusts of uneven thickness, fillings drawn from cans or dried stores, and a serving temperature of lukewarm on a good day. Whipped cream? Only if a cow had trailed you into town. Apple, peach, and berry led the usual lineup. Berry, operating as a generous term that sometimes covered raisins and other objects bearing only a passing resemblance to berries. A cook with a sweet tooth might dust in some cinnamon. Otherwise, the formula was crust, sugar, and optimism. Even so, pie ranked among the great rarities. Most cowboys hadn't tasted one since leaving home, and saloons understood perfectly well that a pie on offer was a competitive weapon. A good slice could draw customers from 2 towns away. And when a pie came out warm and flaky, it was entirely possible somebody would threaten gunplay over the final piece. There survived documented accounts, along with a healthy layer of embellished legend, of poker games that ended in gunfire over dessert disputes. You took the last slice, carried roughly the same weight as an accusation of cheating at cards. In a world where men had been stabbed over spilled whiskey, pie stood somewhere near the sacred. Naturally, not every pie measured up. Some were mostly crust, some were experiments. Some held fillings that had perhaps been fruit at some earlier stage of existence. But when everything aligned, a sober cook, a properly hot oven, fruit that hadn't started fermenting, the result stayed with a man. Amid the dust and hardship of the frontier, a wedge of pie wasn't merely food. It was hope, dished up on a tin plate. Cheese in the Wild West resembled a hand of poker, plenty of risk, a fair amount of bluffing, and decent odds of regretting your decisions by morning. It did exist, genuinely, but only for those who knew where to look, and even then a certain bravery was required, because frontier cheese never arrived in tidy wheels wrapped in wax paper. It was made locally, frequently by somebody whose entire dairy education consisted of reading about fermentation once while drunk. Saloon cheese generally came in two forms: hard, yellow, and suspiciously sweaty, or soft, crumbly, and mildly hostile to the nose. Refrigeration was a luxury, so unless the month happened to be cold or the saloon sat near a cave, the cheese had probably developed a personality of its own by the time it reached you. It might be cheddar, it might be something loosely Swiss. It might be an anonymous lump of dairy guesswork finished with salt. And if it squeaked when you bit into it, well, that was a private matter between you and your jaw. When cheese did appear, it came in rough chunks, set down next to bread, jerky, or, on a fortunate evening, a pickle. Its job was to soften the relentless saltiness of everything around it, and it handed cowboys a little protein to carry them from one brawl to the next. A cook in a creative mood might melt it over a bowl of beans or brown it on top of cornbread. Not every establishment played fair, though. What was sold as cheese was sometimes old butter that had taken a wrong turn, or curdled milk squeezed into a brick and rolled in pepper so you wouldn't look too closely. One traveling merchant claimed the cheese he'd purchased in Nevada tasted like a boiled sock that had somehow grown a rind. He finished every bite anyway, reasoning that even terrible cheese was still cheese. And out on the frontier, a saloon with any cheese at all was notable. It suggested the owner knew a farmer nearby, or at minimum had access to a cow nobody had rustled yet. Cheese wasn't really about taste. It was a statement, a small badge of civilization in a region where plenty of people were still scrubbing themselves with sand. So when a slice of cheese landed on your saloon plate, you eyed it, gave it a sniff, tapped it once with your fork, and then ate it regardless. Out west, a little gambling came standard with dinner. If a thing could be drowned in vinegar and abandoned in a jar, odds are good. Some Wild West saloon put it on the menu. Pickling was never merely a matter of taste. It was how food survived. In the years before refrigeration, saloon kitchens leaned on brine and sourness to stop their supplies from walking off the shelf under their own power. Vegetables, eggs, fruit, even meat, none of it escaped the vinegar. Which is how the frontier ended up with pickled everything. Start with pickled cucumbers, the old standby, crisp, sharp, and occasionally green. They appeared as side dishes, as chasers for whiskey, or simply as something to gnaw on between poor decisions. On a good day, they'd been put up fresh with garlic and spices. On a bad day, they tasted like rainwater mixed with regret. Then there were pickled eggs, a fixture of the trade. They bobbed in murky jars behind the bar, generally within reach of the whiskey, looking like spectral eyeballs and offering the texture of pure sadness. Certain cowboys swore by them, fast protein, effortless to keep, and they mostly stayed down. Other cowboys just swore at them. Pickled onions turned up often in mining towns, biting, tangy, and potent enough to end a conversation you didn't want to have. After one bite, you could speak downwind of a stampede. Occasionally, even pickled peaches or pears showed up, dried fruit steeped in a sweetened brine, until it became a dish that was equal parts baffling and oddly habit-forming. It was damp, vinegar-soaked optimism. The real virtue of anything pickled was endurance. A saloon could hold on to those jars for months, sometimes years, with no fear of spoilage, and in a country where meat turned bad faster than a poker hand, that mattered enormously. Not every pickled item deserved equal trust, though. Jars didn't always seal properly. Cooks sometimes got experimental. and now and then the contents of a jar appeared to be looking back at you. There are stories, quite possibly embellished, of men biting into pickled sausages and discovering bones, or of jars whose entire label read, "Maybe pork." Even so, pickled goods belong to the fabric of the frontier, salty, sour, and strangely satisfying, much like everything else that managed to last out there. Nobody ate them for the joy of it. You ate them because they wouldn't kill you. Probably. When supplies ran low, when the kitchen had shut down, or when the stew appeared to retain a faint pulse, cowboys and drifters fell back on the one item the saloon never ran out of: whiskey. It was permanently in stock, needed zero preparation, and in sufficient quantity made you forget you were hungry, or forget that you had just finished a bowl of unidentified squirrel. Frontier whiskey never rested in oak barrels under a connoisseur's eye. It was coarse, raw, and frequently hazardous, distilled from corn, rye, or whatever raw material the barkeep happened to possess, and produced in back rooms, barns, and the occasional bathtub. The finished product could disinfect a wound, strip paint from a wall, and start a fist fight all in the same evening. Some men called it rot gut, others preferred chain lightning. A dedicated few just called it lunch. When the beans came out burnt and the bread had gone furry, a man simply drank his calories, one scorching shot at a time. Saloon whiskey wasn't only a beverage, it was equipment. It dulled the ache of trail dust, heartbreak, cracked ribs, and stew of deeply uncertain origin. One shot steadied you before a duel, two settled you afterward, and perhaps three more passed the time while you waited to learn whether the bullet wound was serious. Plenty of saloons ran whiskey specials that arrived with a side of beans or a biscuit, included not for flavor, but to keep the customer vertical. Some men took their whiskey with a pickled egg drifting in the glass, an arrangement that somehow qualified as both hydration and protein. And whiskey held frontier society together. You bought round to make friends, to start fights, and now and then to apologize for both. A saloon's reputation could be measured by how quickly its whiskey removed a grown man from his stool. As for quality, better not to inquire. Some of it was little more than moonshine with colouring, doctored with anything from tobacco juice to cayenne pepper. It burned all the way down, and if it didn't, kerosene was a real possibility. Nobody grumbled though, because whiskey was warm, it was cheap, and it was honest, the single item on the menu that never pretended to be something else. And on the nights when your supper arrived in a glass, no fork required and no judgment offered, you lifted it high and declared it dinner. Every Wild West saloon bold enough to serve food harboured a smoke, wreathed shadowy character whose authority rivaled the bartender, the sheriff, and the town preacher put together, the cook. This person, rarely shaven and permanently irritable, was either a life-saving genius or a war criminal of the kitchen, and there was no third option. You would never catch them smiling, but their cooking stayed with you for days, either as gratitude or as gastrointestinal trauma. These were not trained chefs. Saloon cooks tended to be former miners, former convicts, or former something or others whose qualifications amounted to knowing how to build a fire and having no fear of dubious meat. Their kitchen consisted of a fire pit, a dented stove, and one cast iron pan that hadn't seen soap since the gold rush. Somehow, with that arsenal, they fed whole saloons. On a good day they produced a pot of chili capable of moving a grown man to tears, the pleasant kind, along with warm biscuits, beans actually cooked through, and cornbread just sweet enough to make you think of home. On a bad day, the beans came scorched, the meat came grey, and the stew wore a troubling film of oil that kept moving after the pot had stopped. You held your tongue. You had to. The etiquette of the saloon was absolute: never insult the cook. The cook governed everything: the salt, the grease, the exact ratio of mystery to meat. Win their favour and you received the freshest cut in the house. Cross them and you got the spoon scrapings of last night's catastrophe, warmed over and rechristened Chilli Surprise. The cook also moonlighted as the saloon's unofficial bouncer. No sensible man wanted to be struck with a ladle fresh from frying salt pork, and a cook holding a cleaver, as many did, could empty a room faster than a shotgun. Moods aside, these cooks were indispensable. They kept cowboys standing, kept miners conscious, and kept travellers from folding up mid-sentence. They laboured through heat and smoke for endless hours, absorbed insults about their seasoning, and abided by one commandment: if you don't like it, there's the door, or there's the whiskey. Saviour or saboteur. You gave the cook a respectful nod either way, because in the Wild West, that greasy, glorious pair of hands held both your stomach and your fate. Having passed through the swinging doors, taken the measure of the stew, and gone eye to eye with a pickled egg in its foggy jar, we arrive at the honest question: would you actually eat what a Wild West saloon served? Realistically, a modern palate might not make it through the meal. The beans were plain, the meat was a wager, and the stew contained more mystery than nourishment. You would need sturdy teeth, a sturdier stomach, and the kind of hunger that only comes from riding 40 miles on a sunburned horse with nothing but dust filling your lungs. But consider it from the other side. For the cowboys, miners, gamblers, and assorted misfits of the American frontier, saloon food was never about refined flavour or plating fit for a photograph. It was fuel, calories, warmth. A hot plate wedged between gunfights, train robberies, or another night bedding down in a barn beside a mule named Regret. It was survival. You didn't investigate the meat's origins. You didn't object when the biscuit crumbled like chalk. You sat, ate whatever was set in front of you, and rinsed it down with something strong enough to kill the bacteria, or at least strong enough to make you indifferent to them. And on the occasions when the food was genuinely good, when the beans were fresh, the coffee didn't bite back, and the cook had found a little molasses for the cornbread, it felt like nothing short of a miracle. So, would you eat it? If that era had been yours, absolutely. And more than that, you'd have been grateful. You'd have scraped the bowl clean, mopped the plate with your heel of bread, and paid for seconds with coin still carrying the scent of dynamite and horse sweat. You'd have laughed alongside strangers, cursed the cook, raised a whiskey and a toast, and perhaps, with luck, finished the evening with a slice of pie and a story worth repeating. Saloon food was never glamorous. It was gritty, greasy, and real. And in a world where the West remained wild, that was plenty. Long before tattoos were scrawled across biceps and backs in fashionable shops full of buzzing needles, they were something far more ancient, worked into skin, not for style, but for mystery, for meaning, and for survival. Turn the clock back to an age before cities existed, before the gods had even received their names, when human beings lived close to the bone in both spirit and skin. Meet the Iceman. He was found in 1991, locked in a glacier on the border between Austria and Italy, a mummified body more than 5,000 years old, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. And spread across his leathery skin, researchers discovered something startlingly modern. Tattoos, 61 of them to be exact. These were no ornamental spirals or stylized creatures. They were dark marks of carbon, simple dots and lines tracing his spine, tucked behind his knees, circling his ankles. Here, the story turns strange, because the placement of Ötzi's tattoos lined up with recognized acupuncture points. Was this some early attempt at pain relief, an ancient therapeutic practice, or something more spiritual, a rite of endurance cut directly into living flesh? Certainty is beyond us. What is clear is that even in the Stone Age, people were already marking their bodies deliberately with purpose. And Ötzi had company. In ancient Egypt, tattooing appeared chiefly on women, among them priestesses and dancers. These were not decorative butterflies or the names of departed sweethearts, but symbolic designs concentrated around the abdomen, the thighs, and the chest. Some scholars argue they were meant to guard a woman through childbirth, to invite fertility, or to repel malicious spirits, a kind of spiritual armor inked straight onto the body. Farther south, in Nubia below Egypt, archaeologists have uncovered mummies bearing animal figures tattooed along their limbs, bulls and crocodiles, emblems of strength and survival. Across all these early societies, tattoos were never gestures of rebellion. They were expressions of devotion, of endurance, of ritual. Their meaning lived not in pigment alone, but in the pain that placed it there, in its permanence, in the belief behind it. So the next time you notice a full sleeve of ink at the gym or across a subway car, consider that its owner is continuing a practice that began nowhere near a studio. It began in glacial ice, in desert sand, in the sacred quiet of millennia the world has mostly forgotten. If anyone ever believed tattoos were merely edgy accessories or emblems of rebellion, that opinion would not have survived long in the presence of a Polynesian chief. In the cultures of Polynesia, tattoos were neither optional nor ornamental. They were sacred. The very word tattoo descends from the Tahitian tatau, meaning to strike, which is a fair description of the method. Bone implements were dipped in soot and tapped into the skin with a stick, rhythm after rhythm, each tap carrying centuries of custom behind it. In Samoa, in Tonga, and above all among the Maori of New Zealand, tattooing went beyond artistry into identity itself. Consider the moko, the intricate facial tattoo of the Maori. Read correctly, it disclosed nearly everything worth knowing about its wearer, rank, family, ancestry, even personal accomplishments. The face was something more than a canvas. It functioned as a living resume, and to remove it would have amounted to deleting the record of a man's entire life. For young men, the first tattoos typically arrived during grueling ceremonial rites of passage. This was no casual Friday night decision made after a few drinks. It was understood as a spiritual transformation. And the procedure was excruciating. No anesthetics, no numbing creams, only raw courage and a communal conviction that the suffering served a deeper purpose. Women were tattooed as well, frequently on the lips, the chin, or the thighs. Emblems of beauty, of maturity, and of mana. The sacred force believed to move through every living thing. A woman without tattoos might be regarded as somehow unfinished, a blank canvas in a world built on stories. Then colonialism arrived and, true to form, attempted to wipe it all away. Missionaries came bearing scissors, soap, and a generous supply of shame. To them, the tattoos looked primitive, pagan, and distinctly un-Christian. In certain regions, traditional tattooing was outlawed entirely, which merely drove it underground, a holy tongue reduced to murmurs behind closed doors. Yet the ink endured. Today, many Polynesians are reclaiming their tattoo heritage with open pride. The ancient tools are back in use, the old designs have resurfaced, and across the Pacific the tapping of tatau can be heard once more. No longer just an art form, but an act of cultural survival. These marks never were simple decoration. They were, and remain, proclamations of blood, of spirit, and of belonging. Step into the world of togas, gladiators, and philosophers, and tattoos are probably not what you expect to find. Ancient Greece and Rome tend to summon images of marble statues and clean, idealized bodies. Peel back the myth, though, and the ink is there, hiding at the margins. In ancient Greece, tattoos originally belonged to slaves and criminals. The Greek word stigma, yes, the direct ancestor of our word stigmatize, referred to the permanent marks branded or inked into a person's skin as punishment. Nothing symbolic about them, nothing decorative. They were labels, warnings. A runaway slave or a captured enemy might have his forehead tattooed with a message along the lines of, "Stop me, I ran away." A scarlet letter with no expiration date, etched straight into the skin. The Romans, practical as ever, borrowed the idea and pushed it further. Soldiers of the Roman army, particularly those in specialized legions, were often tattooed to certify their loyalty, a kind of dog tag rendered in flesh. But Rome also used ink to brand gladiators, slaves, and prisoners of war. Identity had nothing to do with it. Ownership did. There is a darker thread here as well. Early Christians, persecuted by the Roman authorities, were sometimes tattooed as a deliberate humiliation. Centuries later, Christians turned the practice inside out. Pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem in the Middle Ages often came home with small crosses tattooed on their arms, evidence of their devotion and their suffering. What began as an instrument of punishment had been converted into a badge of faith. Curiously, in later Roman times, Emperor Constantine, the same ruler who legalized Christianity, banned tattooing on the face, not out of mercy. The face, he declared, was made in God's image and should not be defiled. The irony being that the rest of the body remained perfectly fair game. So, where Polynesia treated tattoos as something that raised a person's social standing, the Greco-Roman world generally used them to lower it. A tattoo marked you as an outsider, a sinner, a slave. But it still told a story, rarely the one you would have chosen, yet one you carried forever. In these empires of law, conquest, and spectacle, tattooing was never about self-expression. It was branding, sometimes, quite literally, a tool of control, punishment, and power. And like every mark of oppression, it would eventually be reclaimed. While the West was busy branding its slaves and criminals, the East took a more spiritual, symbolic approach to body art, a world where a tattoo could be sacred protection and social paradox at the same time. Begin with India. The country is more famous for mehendi, the temporary henna designs applied at weddings and festivals, yet it also carries a long history of permanent ink. Among tribal communities such as the Baiga, the Gond, and the Santal, tattoos were considered both ornamental and protective. A woman might be marked with symbols of fertility, strength, or religious devotion. Not on a whim, but as part of a deeply rooted tradition passed from grandmother to granddaughter. These tattoos were more than beautification. They were described as jewelry for the soul, the one adornment no thief could steal and no poverty could take away. Japan's story is more complicated. In the earliest days, during the Jomon period, tattoos may have held spiritual significance, possibly marking status, possibly warding off evil spirits. But as Japan moved into its more rigidly structured eras, above all the Edo period, tattooing took on an entirely new life. First, it became punishment. Criminals were tattooed on the face or arm with marks recording their crime and their region, permanently advertising them as untrustworthy. Imagine walking into a village where everyone could read your sins directly off your skin. Then something fascinating happened. A counterculture emerged. Outcasts, firemen, labourers, and later members of the Yakuza adopted tattoos not as shame but as honour. They created elaborate full-body compositions called irizumi, filled with dragons, tigers, and mythological figures. These were masterpieces worked into the flesh over hundreds of painful hours, each design a personal legend inked beneath the judgment of respectable society. At the same time, Buddhist pilgrims in Southeast Asia developed sakyant tattoos, geometric designs and Pali scriptures believed to confer protection, strength, and spiritual blessing. Monks administered them with sharpened bamboo or steel rods, always accompanied by chants and prayer. In the East, then, a tattoo could be holy or taboo, sacred or criminal. It all depended on who wore it and why. One thing was certain, though, in these cultures, skin never stayed silent. It told of punishment and power, of prayer and pride. As the Roman Empire gave way to the rise of Christianity, the tattoo needle, once a marker of identity or of punishment, began to vanish from the Western world. The reason was simple enough. In the eyes of the Church, the body was no longer mere flesh. It was a temple. And one does not, apparently, scribble on a temple. Some groups embraced tattoos as declarations of faith. Pilgrims bound for Jerusalem had small crosses tattooed on their wrists, a spiritual passport stamped in permanent ink, evidence of a sacred journey endured and survived. But that was the exception, not the rule. By the early Middle Ages, the message from religious authorities was unmistakable. Marking the body was a pagan practice, and pagan meant sinful. The verse most often cited was Leviticus 19:28. You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks upon you. I am the Lord. That single line was enough to bury an entire art form across much of medieval Europe. Tattoos became shorthand for heathenism, witchcraft, and heresy, not the sort of associations anyone wanted near their name while the Inquisition was in business. In monasteries and Christian kingdoms, tattooing all but disappeared, dwindling into rumour and old wives' warnings. Even in that age of suppression, though, the ink never entirely dried. In the far reaches of the Byzantine Empire, certain Christian sects kept religious tattooing alive. Small crosses etched onto hands and arms, often meant as protection against Islamic enslavement. In Ethiopia, Coptic Christians maintained tattoo traditions of their own, marking young believers with sacred symbols as part of spiritual ritual. And among the Crusaders, the knights who marched toward the Holy Land, tattoos made a quiet return. Some etched small crosses onto their bodies, partly for spiritual protection, and partly so that if they died in battle, they would be buried as Christians, their faith visible even in death. The medieval West tried hard to erase the art of tattooing, and it never quite succeeded. The ink hid out in monasteries, along pilgrim trails, in desert churches, biding its time like a relic beneath the soil, waiting for its moment to surface again. As wooden ships began slicing through unknown oceans, tattoos found themselves a brand new canvas. Sailors, not royal court artists, not tribal shamans, hard men with salt-cracked hands and superstitious hearts, who took to decorating their bodies with anchors, mermaids, and crucifixes. How did tattoos find their way back to Europe after centuries in exile? Enter the 18th century voyages of Captain James Cook. When his crews arrived in Polynesia, they encountered entire societies written over in ink. Intrigued and amazed, many sailors got tattooed themselves, partly to honor the cultures they met, and partly, if we're being honest, to prove they had been somewhere exotic. Returning to port with tattoos was more than fashionable. It amounted to a resume, a living record of where a man had sailed and what he had survived. Soon enough, tattoos became the seafaring world's unofficial uniform, and the designs ran deeper than style. They were steeped in superstition. An anchor on the forearm stood for stability. A pig and a rooster, usually tattooed on the feet, were believed to guard against drowning, since those animals were kept in wooden crates that floated when ships went down. Some sailors had "hold fast" lettered across their knuckles, hoping the words would grant them grip enough to survive rough seas and tangled ropes. And then there were the religious icons, crosses on the back, the Virgin Mary over the heart. Sailors trusted these tattoos to provide divine protection. A second skin of spiritual armor for the days when the ocean turned against them. As these inked-up seamen filtered back into European and American ports, tattoos spread along with them, not upward to the nobility, but outward along the fringes, dock workers, soldiers, convicts. Tattoos had become the dialect of the lower classes, of drifters and risk-takers. Even so, they held meaning. In the United States, Civil War soldiers began tattooing their names and regiments onto their arms, a grim piece of preparation in case they died in battle and needed identifying. A modest, painful insurance policy in an age that had not yet invented dog tags. So while kings and clergy shunned the practice, the men who charted the globe carried their ink proudly. To them, every mark was a story and a scar, a talisman and a prayer. And if the end came in waves or cannon fire, it might be the only thing left that told your name. By the 19th and 20th centuries, tattoos had wandered far from temple courtyards and tribal rites. Across much of the world, tattoos had taken on a new job: defiance. Nowhere was that language spoken more fluently than behind bars, a gritty code written in needles, razor blades, and improvised ink. Russia is a good place to begin. In the gulags of the Soviet Union, an entire secret society of tattooing took root under the state's iron shadow. Nothing about it was decorative. Every mark was biography, symbol, and rank, arranged in a hierarchy enforced without mercy. Stars on the shoulders announced a man who commanded respect. Barbed wire circling the neck meant a life sentence. The wearer was never walking out. A cathedral inked across the chest kept count, one dome for every sentence served. Your crimes, your standing, your defiance, all of it was legible on the skin. But the code cut both ways. Wear a symbol you had not earned, and the correction might come by knife, the offending ink carved away by force. Japan told a different version of the story. There, the Yakuza took irizumi, an art that had once been a punishment, and remade it into a badge of honor. Full-body suits of dragons, koi fish, and samurai warriors ran from shoulder to ankle, usually kept out of sight beneath a business suit. To be tattooed this way was not simply an act of rebellion. It was a rite of loyalty, painful, expensive, and impossible to take back. The West had its own prison dialect. In American jails, a teardrop under the eye could mean the wearer had committed murder, or, in some cases, had lost someone close. Cobwebs spun across the elbows stood for long stretches served. Dots across the knuckles, numbers, acronyms, whole identities rewritten in ink, invisible to the guards and perfectly clear to anyone who spoke the language. The tools were smuggled: sewing needles, paper clips, pens melted down into ink. There was nothing glamorous about any of it, only pain, and what the pain stood for. For many inmates, this was never really about art. It was about identity, proof that you belonged somewhere, or a warning that you did not. Beyond the walls, the same tattoos carried a heavy stigma. They marked a person as dangerous, untouchable, beyond saving. But for the men and women who wore them, the ink was often the only constant they had, the one piece of themselves they still owned inside a system engineered to take everything else. Prison tattoos were not fashion, they were survival. By the time the 20th century found its stride, the tattoo had travelled from sacred symbol and outlaw code into mainstream rebellion. Where the church had once read ink as the mark of sin, modern society began reading it as freedom, and, now and then, as a very particular flavour of cool. In the early 1900s, circus sideshows still featured tattooed performers, tattooed ladies and illustrated men charging admission to display skin inked edge to edge. Audiences gasped and stared. It was taboo, packaged as spectacle. Around the middle of the century, though, something moved. Soldiers returning from the Second World War brought home simple designs: anchors, eagles, hearts with mum scrolled across the middle. Personal emblems of pain, patriotism, or plain survival. These were never meant for an audience. They were keepsakes, burned into skin to remember what they had seen and the brothers they had lost. Then the counterculture arrived. Through the 1960s and 70s, tattoos slipped their blue-collar moorings and turned up on rock stars, bikers, and beat poets. Janis Joplin had a bracelet tattooed around her wrist. The Hells Angels wore their ink the way soldiers wear medals. Getting tattooed, still faintly scandalous to polite company, became a declaration in itself. Nobody else's opinion had been consulted. And the parlours changed with the customers. No longer hidden dens down seedy alleys, they began going legitimate. Artists like Lyle Tuttle, famous for inking Cher and the Rolling Stones, treated the needle as a brush. Suddenly tattoos were more than symbols. They were statements, personal, political, powerful. The stigma, however, faded on its own slow schedule. Well into the 1990s and early 2000s, visible ink could still cost you a job. No visible tattoos was printed directly onto plenty of application forms. Tattoos still murmured of crime, deviance or recklessness, and women's tattooed bodies were policed more harshly than anyone's. Yet the tide kept turning. Tattoo shows appeared on television. Celebrities turned up with full sleeves. Conventions multiplied in city after city. What had been a subculture simply became culture. From rebellion to runway, the tattoo had re-entered the mainstream at last, though it never quite forgot where it came from. In an era when everything from our voices to our memories lives in the cloud, something as stubbornly analog as a tattoo might well have been left behind. Instead, the opposite happened, a renaissance. Tattoos did not merely survive the digital age, they evolved with it. Today they are more than ink and skin, supported by apps, augmented by technology, and drawn with machines that would have reduced a 19th century sailor to tears. Some artists now use AI to generate designs of impossible detail. Others work with machines that lay down ink with surgical precision. And then there are smart tattoos, experimental patches embedded with sensors that can track vital signs, control devices, or even glow with LED ink. This is not science fiction. It is already being tested in laboratories. Even without the gadgetry, the trade is booming. What was once forbidden is now celebrated across professions, genders, and cultures. Doctors wear full sleeves. Teachers wear thin bands of ink at the wrist. Chief executives stroll into boardrooms with elaborate back pieces hidden under their suits. Social media has flattened the whole field. A tattoo done in Seoul can go viral in Seattle. Artists build worldwide followings overnight, and a client can book a session with one tap on a phone. And the meaning has not thinned out. If anything, it has grown more personal. People now tattoo the sound waves of a loved one's voice, the coordinates of the spot where they met their partner, portraits of their pets, the constellations overhead on the night a child was born, quotes in forgotten languages, etched permanently to remember, to heal, to belong. Cultural tattooing is returning as well. Indigenous communities from the Arctic to the Andes are reviving ancestral patterns, reclaiming identity through the skin itself. What was once suppressed is now worn in the open, a walking act of remembrance. The arguments have not gone quiet, of course. Art or passing trend, sacred or superficial, can a story still be your own once it has been filtered through algorithms and like counts? Perhaps that is exactly the point. Tattoos have always occupied the grey territory between pain and beauty, between permanence and change. They are primal and futuristic at once, a whisper out of the past and a declaration aimed at tomorrow. And for as long as human beings want meaning, memory, and a mark to show for it, the tattoo will endure. Beneath the surface, ink keeps speaking, even where words cannot. Long before empires collided and the sand drank blood, before kings flinched at her name, Tomyris was simply a daughter of the wind. Born to the raw open steppe, she came from a land with no gilded marble, no echoing philosophy. It was brutal, it was free, and it went on forever. This was the world of the Massagetae, fierce nomadic horse archers who moved across the plains like spirits, their whole existence shaped by survival, honor, and war. Of Tomyris's childhood we know almost nothing, but the rhythm of it is easy enough to imagine. She would have been riding before she could run, shooting a bow before she could manage full sentences. Among the Massagetae, girls were not shut away in tents or hushed into silence. They trained alongside the boys, rode with the warriors, and grew up with iron in their blood. To lead, a person first had to bleed, and Tomyris, even as a young woman, bled for her people. Her tribe worshipped the sun and the sky, lived from their herds, and buried their dead armed ready for battle in the world beyond. They built no cities and raised no golden temples, but they had pride, and when enemies drew near, they answered with arrows rather than prayers. Tomyris most likely rose to power after the death of her husband, who may have ruled the tribe before her. What is certain is that when the moment came, she did not inherit leadership. She seized it. In an age when most women were counted as property, Tomyris commanded an army. She negotiated with kings. She dared to speak as an equal, and when they would not listen, she made them. She was more than a queen. She was Shah Mat, the stepped checkmate, a war chief in bronze and leather who was about to stand against the greatest empire on earth. But power, especially a woman's power, never comes free of consequence. As Tomyris consolidated her rule, the whispers grew louder, and beyond the mountains to the south, a king was watching. His name was Cyrus the Great, and he wanted more. The stage was set, the steppe wind howled, and Tomyris, daughter of warriors, was about to ride into legend. While Tomyris governed the open steppes, far to the south a very different kind of power was rising. structured, imperial, relentless. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire, had already taken Lydia in the west and Babylon in the south. His banners stood over deserts, mountains, and cities where the language changed every few days' ride. And Cyrus was not finished. He was a builder of empires, and builders of empires always end up staring at the horizon. To Cyrus, the Massagetae were a threat wrapped inside an opportunity. They held no great wealth in gold or cities, but they controlled the northeastern frontier, and that meant access to key lands, resources, and trade routes. More important still, the Massagetae possessed something no empire could afford to ignore: pride. And pride, as Cyrus reckoned it, could be bent, or, failing that, broken. He also understood that brute force is rarely the best opening move. Cyrus had a reputation for cleverness, diplomacy, and strategic trickery, so he reached first for a gentler instrument, one kings before him had used to dissolve a threat without spilling a drop of blood. He proposed marriage. According to the ancient sources, Herodotus chief among them, Cyrus sent envoys to Tomyris offering an alliance through matrimony. On paper it was a royal match, the great king of Persia and the warrior queen of the Massagetae. Tomyris, however, was nobody's fool. She read the proposal for exactly what it was: not love, not partnership, but a calculated bid to absorb her people without a fight. She declined, and the refusal did not go over well in the halls of Persepolis. With the diplomatic games finished, Cyrus reverted to the language he trusted most: war. He ordered his army across the Araxes River, the natural barrier dividing Persia from the lands of the Massagetae. What Tomyris would not give, he intended to take. But Tomyris was already preparing. She knew the terrain. She knew how her people fought from horseback, fast and furious. And above all, she understood that Cyrus was not coming merely for land. He was coming to crush a woman who had dared to say no. The most powerful king in the world had declared war, with no idea what kind of fury he had just stirred awake on the steppe. Cyrus the Great, master strategist, seasoned conqueror, was confident he could outthink Tomyris. He had faced down kings, flattened cities, and brought whole nations to heel. In his eyes, the Massagetae were little more than wild nomads, fast horses, no cities worth defending. He did not realize he was walking into the path of someone every bit as cunning as he was, and far more furious. Tomyris had given him fair warning. After turning down his marriage offer, she sent one clear message: cross the Araxes River, and you will regret it. Cyrus crossed anyway, laying a bridge of boats to carry his army into Massagetae country. Rather than strike at once, Tomyris drew her forces back, pulling Cyrus deeper into unfamiliar ground. The Persians found an abandoned camp, generously stocked with food, and, more to the point, with wine, a luxury the nomadic Massagetae rarely allowed themselves. The whole thing had been bait, and Cyrus swallowed it, much likely convinced that his enemy had lost their nerve and scattered. He left a share of his army behind in the camp under Harpagus, an officer he trusted. When the Massagetae came back under the cover of darkness, they struck the drunken, unwary Persians with cold accuracy. The fighting was short and merciless. Among the slain lay Spargapizes, the son of Tomyris and a commander of the Massagetae himself. What followed is told in more than one way. By some accounts he was taken alive, and once he understood that he was a prisoner, he asked for death and ended his own life. Others say he simply fell in the fighting. Every version agrees on one thing: when the word reached his mother, something in her broke and then hardened into iron. Her grief poured out like lava, but it was her fury that would be remembered. She sent Cyrus one more message, and this time it carried no warning. It was a promise. "You may hunger for blood," she told him, "yet I swear I will give you your fill." She vowed to soak the earth red with Persian blood, and her revenge would be anything but silent. Cyrus had killed her son. He had trespassed on her land. Now he would face not the queen of the Massagetae, but the mother of a murdered warrior, and the last face he would ever look upon. The next fight would be no skirmish. It would be a reckoning. The sun climbed over the plains like a drawn blade, bright and blinding. Tomyris took her place at the front of her army, no longer only a queen but a storm wearing human shape. Her fighters, toughened by a life on the move, streaked their faces with ash and anger. Politics had fallen away. What remained was blood. For all his power, Cyrus had misjudged the Massagetae. He expected them to fight like the tribes he had already broken, disorganized, clumsy, and easy to scatter. But Tomyris had spent her whole life among warriors, and she knew how to strike, not wildly, but with purpose. She gathered her forces for an all-out assault on the Persian invaders, and this time she kept nothing in reserve. The place where the last battle happened is lost to us, buried in the sheer size of the steppe. What is certain is that Tomyris hurled her people forward in a savage counterattack. Her horsemen rolled across the grasslands like a wave of knives, loosing arrows from the saddle, closing with axes, and fighting like people who had nothing left to protect. The Persians, seasoned and disciplined as they were, had not braced for this kind of ordered rage. Tomyris did more than command. She fought in the thick of it. Her presence set her warriors alight like dry grass. Every blow answered her son's death. Every charge repaid it. Cyrus tried to steady his line, and the line came apart. The Persians were shattered. Many were cut down where they held their ground. Others ran into the endless grass, only to be run down. And Cyrus the Great, the man who had swallowed Babylon and Lydia and reached for nearly the whole known world, went down in the ruin. Whether he was killed outright or captured and put to death depends on who tells the tale, but either way he died on Tomyris's terms. What came afterward became notorious. Herodotus writes that Tomyris found Cyrus's corpse on the field, had his head cut off, and then, in one last stroke of symbolic vengeance, plunged it into a skin filled with human blood. "Drink your fill," she said, "of the blood you craved." Was it plain history or poetic dressing? Perhaps some of both, though it hardly mattered. The message outlasted the doubt. Tomyris was not a woman to be conquered. When the dust had settled and the grass had drunk deep of an empire's blood, she stood as the victor, a warrior queen who had accomplished what no king or army before her had managed. She had brought Cyrus the Great to his end. The news rippled out across the ancient world in shock. The mighty Achaemenid Empire, thought to be beyond stopping, had been humbled by a woman from the steppe. The Persians tried to soften the story, but the death of their founder could not be waved away. In time, Cyrus's body was carried home and laid to rest with honor in the royal tomb at Pasargadae. Even so, the mark of that final defeat clung to the empire's memory like an old wound. For Tomyris and the Massagetae, though, the win was more than payback. It was a statement. They had guarded their freedom not with weapons alone, but with dignity. Tomyris had faced down the most powerful ruler on earth, and she had not merely lived through it, she had won. And then she slipped out of the record entirely. Nothing survives about her later years, her death, or any heir she might have named. It is almost as if, once her vengeance was complete, she simply turned her horse toward the horizon and left the wind to carry her legend on. In the centuries that came after, Historians, poets, and chroniclers tried to fill the silence, shaping her into a symbol as much as a person. To the Persians, her name was a bitter memory. To the Greeks, she was a puzzle, a so-called barbarian who showed more nobility than plenty of kings. And among the peoples of Central Asia, she became folklore, a spectral queen who still rides the steppe, fierce and unbending, carrying a sword that remembers. Her image inspired countless portrayals across cultures. Medieval manuscripts dressed her in royal armor. Renaissance painters set her towering over the body of Cyrus. In every age she became whatever people needed: an avenging mother, a wild queen, a warning about pride, or an emblem of a woman's power. But one truth pierces straight through the myth: she altered history. Tomyris did not inherit a throne. She hammered it out of fire and fury, and for one brief, unforgettable stretch, the steppe queen proved that not every empire rises. Some fall beneath the hooves of warriors who ride with vengeance in their hearts. Nearly everything we know about Tomyris comes not from the Massagetae themselves, who left behind no stone tablets and no royal archives, but from the pen of a Greek, Herodotus, the man often called the father of history. Writing about a century after her lifetime, he preserved Tomyris in his histories as a warrior queen of astonishing resolve and fearsome revenge. Yet Herodotus was not only recording facts, he was crafting a story, part chronicle and part moral lesson. For him and his Greek readers, Tomyris stood for the ultimate downfall of imperial arrogance. Cyrus the Great, who had conquered half the known world, was undone not by a vast army or a rival monarch, but by a woman fighting for her child rather than for glory. Her triumph felt almost mythic, and Herodotus told it that way. He even set down the gruesome details: the wineskin of blood, the severed head, and her cutting words, "Drink your fill." But did it happen? Modern historians argue about it without end. Some suspect Herodotus stretched the truth or invented parts of it, using Tomyris as a device to humble the Persian Empire, which in his day still loomed over the Greek world. Others hold that even if the blood-filled wineskin is symbolic, the heart of the account, Cyrus dying at the hands of Tomyris, probably did occur. There is also the matter of bias. For all his sharpness, Herodotus tended to view foreign peoples through a Greek lens. He painted the Massagetae as wild and free yet noble, an exotic reflection of Greek ideals of honor and liberty. Within that frame, Tomyris was not simply a barbarian. She was a moral counterweight to Persian ambition. Even so, whatever blurred with the passing years, Herodotus achieved one thing for certain. He made sure Tomyris would never be forgotten. Because of him, she grew into far more than a footnote. She stepped into the country of legend, where facts grow soft but consequence grows sharp. And in that borderland between myth and memory, her story found a strange kind of immortality. In a world ruled by kings and conquerors, Herodotus handed down to us a queen who would not kneel and who left her enemies bleeding in the sand. Though she may have killed one of the ancient world's most famous emperors, Tomyris never governed an empire of her own. She raised no cities of stone and carved no decrees into golden tablets. Her people, the Massagetae, were nomads who lived not behind walls, but by the rhythms of the land, the sky, and the horse. That is why Tomyris's legacy was never set into any institution. There were no marble busts, no royal coins stamped with her face, no archives to keep her rulings alive. Her story travelled instead the way stories travel on the steppe, through firelight, through song, and through the hushed awe of warriors. The Massagetae were one of many strong tribes of the Central Asian steppe. Their kin included the Scythians, the Saka, and the Dahai, all master horse archers who ranged across the country between the Caspian Sea and the edges of ancient China. Empires feared these tribes for their speed, their unpredictability, and their savagery in battle. Tomyris, a woman leading among them, was rare but not entirely without precedent. Steppe society, unlike many settled civilizations, gave women far wider freedom. They rode, hunted, fought, and sometimes led. Among the Scythians, archaeologists have uncovered the graves of women buried with weapons, armor, and horse gear, confirming that tales of fierce steppe queens were more than invention. Tomyris stood at the summit of that tradition. Her authority came not from inheritance or religion, but from respect, toughness, and plain ability. She was a force that pulled scattered clans together, a political leader and a military commander in a land where staying alive meant riding faster, shooting straighter, and fearing nothing. But because the Massagetae raised no monuments, Tomyris became a kind of phantom queen, her name surviving only in the writings of outsiders and in the spoken traditions of the steppe. To Persian scribes she was a warning, to the Greeks a wonder, and to her own people most likely a memory carried in bloodlines and battle songs, a ghost who rode with them across the plains. Empires may rise and crumble in stone, but the stories of the steppe live on in the wind, and Tomyris, fierce, grieving, and unbroken, became its voice. The centuries rolled on, and the empires that once ringed the Massagetae rose and fell. Cyrus's heirs built Persepolis, clashed with Alexander the Great, and faded into the dusty footnotes of time. Yet her legend held on, not in the palaces of kings, but in the hearts of those who refused to bow. Across Central Asia she grew into something larger than a queen. She became a symbol of a woman's strength, of resistance, of the untamed spirit of the steppe. In many ways Tomyris carried a defiance that crossed every border. She was not Roman, not Greek, not Persian, and so her story belonged to no empire at all. That made her both dangerous and inspiring. In the medieval Islamic world, chroniclers now and then set down her name, reshaped by their languages but never quite lost. In some tellings she was praised for her justice and her revenge. In others she was cast as a savage queen, a reminder that power in a woman's hands could be at once glorious and terrifying. By the time the Renaissance arrived, European artists rediscovered her tale through the writings of Herodotus. Painters showed her in ornate armor, standing in triumph over the lifeless body of Cyrus. In one dramatic canvas she lifts his severed head like a trophy, blood-soaked and victorious. It was theatrical, yes, but it was also political. These artists were captivated by the idea of a woman who did not merely survive in a man's world. She won. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Tomyris became a national icon in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Poets wrote her back into the culture, and teachers put her back into the curriculum, holding her up as evidence that the region's identity had roots that were fierce, proud, and unmistakably female. Her name found its way into school books, onto statues, even into military ceremony. The woman who had once governed from a saddle with a bow in her hand was riding again, this time through memory and legend, through defiance and national pride. In a world that still argues about powerful women, Tomyris remains an uncomfortable case. She was not flawless, not saintly, and certainly not tame. She made hard decisions quickly, used brutality when the moment demanded it, and reserved her compassion for those who had earned it. She was resistance given human shape, and the imperial blood on her hands was a crown she never once apologized for wearing. History has a habit of rewarding a certain kind of ruler, the ones who raise monuments, draft law codes, and chisel their own names into stone. Tomyris did none of that. She left no empire for successors, no palace for archaeologists to dig up, no royal seal for scholars to puzzle over. Her name endures anyway, not because her rule lasted, but because she refused to be erased. She stands as a rebuke to the way history usually files women away, as helpers, as footnotes, rather than as forces of destiny. She never begged for recognition. She took it with blood and fire. She did not ride at a king's back. She rode straight at one and beat him. Her story is still taught in classrooms from Central Asia to Europe, not merely because she brought down Cyrus the Great, but because she dared to stand against him at all. She was not defending an empire. She was defending a way of being free, a freedom that travelled on horseback, hunted with hawks and slept beneath the open sky, a freedom no mapmaker could pin down. Today her statues rise in Kazakhstan's capital cities, and her face looks out from coins and textbook pages. To modern Central Asians, she is a mother of nations, a link to a proudly nomadic past older than Islam and older than the Soviets, a reminder that their identity began not in submission, but in a war cry and the drumming of hooves. In a world still divided by power, gender, and memory, Tomyris is a beacon, not just because she killed a great king, but for the larger lesson inside the act: dignity is not handed out, it is taken. And sometimes leadership looks like a mother grieving her son and refusing to let his killer ride away. Why do some names outlast the centuries while others dissolve? Tomyris survived because she could not be forgotten. In an era when women were expected to vanish into the tents of men, she rose instead, blade in hand, fury in her chest, and cut her story into the flesh of history. Empires collapse, statues wear down, legends keep riding. And somewhere out on the whispering winds of the steppe, the queen gallops still, unbroken, undefeated, and impossible to forget. Long before anyone worried about encryption keys or surveillance cameras, people faced a much plainer question: how do you keep your belongings safe from curious neighbors, wandering animals, and thieves with initiative? As human societies traded the nomadic life for settled civilizations, property began to pile up, and property, inevitably, brought its companions, envy, theft, and the growing need to protect. The urge to guard what we treasure is old, primal, arguably. The moment people started keeping food, tools, or sacred objects inside permanent houses and temples, they needed a way to keep everyone else out. But no one can stand watch around the clock. The solution: invent a mechanism to stand watch on your behalf. The oldest known experiment in mechanical security comes from ancient Egypt, roughly 4,000 years ago. And the remarkable part is not merely that the Egyptians had locks at all, it is that the core principle behind them is still in service today. The Egyptian wooden pin lock was a small triumph of early engineering. Its heart was a wooden bolt drilled with a row of holes, each hole holding a wooden peg. When the matching key, usually a sizable wooden implement carrying its own set of pins, was slid into place, it lifted the pegs just enough to free the bolt, letting it slide open. Pull the key out, and gravity took over. The pins dropped back down, and the door was sealed once more. These were no curiosities. They secured storerooms, tombs, even the gates of temples, and they were commonly mounted vertically, often on the inner face of the door, precisely to make tampering harder. They looked primitive from a modern vantage point, but the thinking behind them was anything but. These devices were not mere barriers, they were puzzles. And like any decent puzzle, they existed to defeat the uninvited. They also tell us something deeper about the people who built them. These were minds that did not just fear thieves, they expected them. They planned ahead. They spent time and craftsmanship defending the things that mattered to them, and in doing so they founded an entire branch of human ingenuity, security. So the next time you turn your deadbolt, remember that you are not just locking a door. You are carrying on a practice begun by ancient hands in service of a truth that has never expired. Some things are worth guarding. The Egyptian wooden pin lock was more than the earliest lock we know of. It was the direct ancestor of virtually every pin tumbler mechanism in use today, simple, elegant, and quietly effective. For centuries it protected Egyptian temples, houses, and storerooms, and it all began with a few pieces of wood, one clever design, and a very human need for privacy. Picture a heavy wooden door, not hinged in the modern fashion, but more like an upright barrier of planks. On its inner side runs a wooden bolt that slides sideways to bar the entrance. Bored into that bolt are several holes, and in each hole rests a wooden peg. When those pegs drop into slots carved in the door frame, the bolt is pinned in place. The door is locked. Now for the clever part. The key. A large wooden tool resembling an oversized modern toothbrush carries its own pegs or pins, positioned to match the ones in the bolt. Slide the key in, and its pins nudge the lock's pins upward just far enough to clear the slots in the frame. The bolt is free, the door opens. Withdraw the key and gravity finishes the job. The pins tumble back into the frame holes, and the door locks itself again. It was mechanical memory with no springs and no gears, just timber, weight, and ingenuity. Part of what made the design so impressive was the balance it struck between complexity and reliability. It could be built from materials close at hand, yet defeating it without the proper key was genuinely difficult. And because every lock was carved by hand, no two came out alike. Keys were not interchangeable. Your lock was yours alone. Nor were these pin locks the privilege of the rich and royal alone. Excavations at sites like Nineveh and later at Persian and Assyrian locations show the concept traveling widely across the ancient world. Egypt may have invented the idea, but the lock proved to be a great traveler. There was symbolic weight at work too. On tombs and sacred buildings, locking something meant more than physical protection. It expressed reverence, finality, the belief that certain things should remain untouched unless you were worthy enough to hold the key. In ancient Egypt, security was not only a function, it was a statement. While Egypt was producing the first mechanical locks, ancient Mesopotamia was pioneering a very different school of security, one built less on machinery and more on identity. In the country between the Tigris and the Euphrates, safety was not bolted shut with tumblers. It was pressed into clay in the language of symbols, authority, and trust. The peoples of Mesopotamia, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, protected their goods not by locking them away, but by making any unauthorized access impossible to hide. Their instrument was the cylinder seal, a small carved stone roller engraved with a unique image or inscription. Rolled across the wet clay that closed a container, a door, or an official document, it left an unbroken, distinctive pattern that was extremely hard to duplicate. Something like a signature, a wax seal, and a barcode rolled into one. If anyone interfered, opened the container, broke the latch, unwrapped the tablet, the damage announced itself. The broken clay was the witness. The approach was simple and, in its way, profound. In a world with no padlocks and no alarms, Mesopotamian security relied on deterrence through visibility. The seal never physically stopped you from opening anything. It simply guaranteed that everyone would know you had. High officials, merchants and priests each owned personalized cylinder seals, often passed down through the generations. The objects carried such prestige that some people were buried with them, status symbols in this life, useful equipment for the next. Clay was not the whole story either. Temple treasuries and granaries were bound with ropes that could only be removed by cutting, tied off with elaborate knots or seals that would plainly betray any tampering. The principle never varied: make the fear of exposure weigh more than the reward of theft. This idea of security as accountability, tying access to a person's identity and social standing, would echo for millennia. We still log in with usernames, still verify with signatures, still put more faith in records than in locks. In Mesopotamia, to protect a thing was not merely to hide it. It was to announce publicly exactly who had the right to touch it. As the Greek city-states grew wealthier and more complicated, their need for personal security grew with them. From temple treasuries to coin-filled storerooms to private houses, the Greeks confronted the same ancient dilemma: how do you keep things safe when you cannot always be there to guard them? Curiously, the Greeks lagged behind their Egyptian and Mesopotamian neighbors in developing mechanical locks. They leaned instead on trust, social convention, and physical barriers, occasionally reinforced by devices that were clever, if unmistakably rudimentary. One such invention was the bar and pin lock, used mostly on doors and chests. A horizontal bar lay across the inside of the door, and through a hole, a key could be worked in from outside to lift that bar. The keys tended to be large, flat rods of iron bent into shapes resembling the letter F or P, hardly discrete objects. Some approached the length of a forearm, and carrying one through the streets advertised rather plainly that you owned something worth stealing. Yet Greek keys and locks were more than hardware. They carried cultural meaning. To be entrusted with a key was to be entrusted with authority and responsibility. In Homer's Odyssey, Penelope is described holding the key to Odysseus' storeroom, an emblem of her power within the household. Greek locks had their limits, though. They were often rough, easily forced, and dependent more on sheer bulk than on subtlety. What genuinely kept valuables safe was usually a combination of concealment, guards, and communal expectation. In temples and state treasuries, rooms were sealed with rope and wax, and the city-state held multiple keys, so that opening a sacred store required several officials to be present at once. Even private homes were designed with layered access, room behind room, limited points of entry, gates that could be barred from within. A wealthy household might also keep slaves or hire guards to watch over its valuables, a human layer of protection resting on top of fairly simple machinery. The Greeks admired cleverness, metis, that cunning practical intelligence. But they had not yet turned it toward lock-making the way later civilizations would. What they did lay down was the cultural groundwork: the key as a badge of status, access as a matter of trust, and security as a balance between strength and social control. The Egyptians may have invented the pin lock, and the Greeks may have woven trust into tradition, but it was Rome that turned lock-making into a genuine, practical art. The Romans had metallurgy on their side, along with a deep fondness for order and a bureaucracy of staggering size, and they applied all three to the problem of security, bringing precision, portability, and steady invention to it. Their ideas are still audible, faintly, inside the locks we use now. Roman locks were built mostly from bronze and iron, which meant they lasted far longer and could be made far smaller and more intricate than the wooden mechanisms that came before. The Egyptian pin tumbler idea was borrowed, shrunk down, polished, and in some cases rethought entirely. Roman locksmiths also produced warded locks, which relied on internal obstructions, the wards, arranged so that only a key of exactly the right shape could turn and release the mechanism. Poking around with a random tool got you nowhere. The key had to correspond to the geography inside. The keys themselves deserve a moment. Cast in iron or bronze, they came in every size imaginable, from enormous staff-like keys that opened city gates down to delicate ring keys worn on the finger, the way one might wear jewelry. And those ring keys were not merely decorative. They gave their owner constant access to locked boxes and cabinets without the burden of hauling bulky tools around. Status and usefulness fused into a single band of metal. The true showpieces, though, were the Roman puzzle locks, elaborate mechanisms concealed inside ornamented boxes, where pressing the wrong latch or turning at the wrong angle did more than fail. It could seize the lock even tighter. These boxes guarded valuables, yes, but also documents, religious relics, and on occasion poison, which was something of a house specialty in Roman political circles. Rome also made the lock institutional. Banks used them. Granaries used them. Merchant chests and military storerooms used them. Doors carried metal plates, gates carried locking bars, and slaves could be fitted with iron collars whose keys existed only in a master's hand. For a Roman, a lock was never just hardware. It announced ownership, authority, and exclusion, and it carried the notion that a truly civilized society needed more than walls to protect it. It needed systems. While the West was hammering out its intricate metalwork, ancient China went a different way, folding practicality into philosophy. Chinese engineers, pragmatic as ever, built locking systems that were simple, sturdy, and frequently symbolic, locks whose design did not merely protect an object, but said something about it. The most widespread form of ancient Chinese lock was the sliding bolt type, made mainly of bronze or iron. These usually consisted of a hollow metal case containing a bolt held in place by spring-loaded tumblers. Slide in the correct key, typically a flat, ridged strip of metal, and the tumblers lined up, freeing the bolt and opening the lock. If that arrangement sounds familiar, it should. The core idea behind the modern pin tumbler lock was already working away in Han Dynasty China as early as 200 BCE. Where Roman locks tended toward external keyholes and decorative flourish, Chinese locks were compact, understated, and easy to carry. They secured chests, gates, jewelry boxes, and doors, and the priority was always what the lock did rather than how it looked. Yet Chinese locks were never only machines. Many were cast in the shapes of animals, tigers, dragons, turtles, or engraved with characters signifying luck, protection, or wealth. A lock shaped like a fish might sit on a money box as an emblem of abundance. A dragon lock on a door did more than secure it. It informed any would-be intruder that a powerful force stood guard over whatever lay beyond. Locks took on ceremonial work as well. At weddings, love locks were sometimes fastened onto symbolic boxes or chests representing the couple's bond, and handing over the key formed part of the marriage ritual itself, a gesture of trust and commitment made physical. Certain locks, the puzzle variety in particular, were built specifically to bewilder thieves. They hid their mechanisms, offered false keyholes, or demanded a precise sequence of movements before they would open. The point was not that they were harder to smash. The point was that they cost time, and in the ancient world, delay was often the whole difference between a theft that failed and one that succeeded. Chinese security culture in the end was not organized around flatly refusing entry. It aimed for harmony between usefulness, symbolism, and clever design, and out of that blend of form and function came a quiet legacy, one that continues in subtle locks and symbolic rituals to this day. Ancient India took security in yet another direction, favoring clever concealment, symbolic barriers, and layered protection over brute force, blending spiritual thinking with engineering. Indian locks were not built simply to keep people out. They were designed to confuse, mislead, and warn, often incorporating secret latches, false compartments, or symbolic inscriptions until security became something close to a philosophical practice. Deception was the signature move. Puzzle locks and trick mechanisms became common on temples and treasure chests, not because they made forced entry impossible, but because they made it complicated enough to be discouraging. Some demanded several actions in sequence: press a concealed button, work a second lever, and only then would the key consent to turn. Others sported decoy keyholes whose entire job was to mislead the uninvited. Temples received the most elaborate treatment. They held gold offerings, sacred texts, and revered relics, and rather than hiding all of it behind a single locked door, priests stacked their defenses, physical and ritual alike. A storage chamber might be closed with wax, knotted rope, and a stamped clay emblem, each layer carrying its own spiritual weight. Breaking such a seal was not merely a crime, it was sacrilege. The locks themselves were routinely engraved with religious imagery, elephants, lotus flowers, deities, protective mantras. To touch such a lock without permission was, in many eyes, an offence against the gods themselves. In royal courts and merchant caravans, small portable locks guarded scrolls, trade boxes, and private doors, usually worked in iron or brass so they would be both light and durable. Key design was fiercely individual, sometimes so unique that a single artisan made both the lock and its matching key, guaranteeing security through sheer obscurity. And, as elsewhere in Asia, locks carried ceremonial duties. In marriage rituals and matters of inheritance, the unlocking of a sealed chest signified more than access to wealth. It marked the handover of trust, legacy, and duty. For ancient India, the finest lock did not simply bar the way. It puzzled, it protected, and it murmured, "Only the rightful may pass." As civilizations expanded and trade routes stretched from Rome all the way to China, portable security became an urgent need. Whether the cargo was a merchant's caravan goods or a general's war chest, ancient locks now had to do more than guard temples and doors. They had to travel. Commerce in the ancient world was thriving. Silk moved west out of China. Spices flowed from India. Glassware, textiles, coins, and scrolls crossed and recrossed the continents. Prosperity, though, came with company. Bandits waiting along the roads, dishonest porters pilfering from the cargo, and journeys so long that valuables passed through many hands with the owner nowhere in sight. The answer was a lock that was compact, durable, and hard to tamper with. Roman merchants favoured small iron padlocks for chests, saddlebags, and warehouse doors. spring-loaded mechanisms paired with ring keys, solid enough to defeat casual theft, yet light enough for the road. They have turned up everywhere from Britain to Syria, buried in ruins or rusted shut in shipwrecks, and their sheer spread testifies to a worry every trader shared, keeping mobile wealth safe. Chinese traders and officials carried portable sliding locks, often bronze, fixed to chests or carts. Some were artfully disguised, passing as ornament or built invisibly into the box itself, and many bore engraved symbols or inscriptions marking ownership. If someone snapped the lock, the damage announced itself, and the act could be prosecuted both as a crime and as a dishonor. Across Central Asia, nomadic peoples worked out clasped systems of leather and metal, with rings and latches that could be tied or locked across tent flaps, horse packs, and weapon cases. These were simpler devices, but they traded complexity for speed and visibility. One glance told a traveller whether their goods had been touched. War had its own uses for the lock. Weapon caches, treasury wagons, and command tents were all secured, because in battle, controlling access mattered, not just to supplies, but to information. Scrolls and maps sometimes travelled in locked boxes fitted with multiple mechanisms, so that more than one officer was required to open them. Two-factor authorization, several thousand years early. And across every culture the pattern held, the more mobile the world became, the more ingenious its locks had to be. The road offered opportunity and danger in equal measure, and ancient travellers met that danger not only with swords but with keys. When we turn a key in a door today, or tap a code into a lock screen, we rarely consider the thousands of years of quiet ingenuity behind that small motion. Yet every click, latch and password belongs to a story that began in the dust of Egyptian temples, in the bronze workshops of Rome, and along the silent trade routes that stitched the ancient world together. What those early locks left behind is not just mechanical, it is psychological. They express something deeply human, the urge to protect, to exclude, to draw a line around what is ours. Whether it was a wooden bolt in Thebes, a ring key in Pompeii, or a puzzle lock in Chang'an, the idea never changed. Build a boundary that only the rightful person may cross. Over time, those boundaries became symbols in their own right. A lock on a temple door did not merely guard gold, it kept the sacred intact. A seal on a scroll did not merely hide knowledge, it advertised power. We still do this. A locked diary, a wedding chest, a secure vault, the machinery has advanced, but the meaning has not moved an inch. In many ways, the most remarkable thing about ancient security is how little of it has changed. The modern pin tumbler lock still mirrors its Egyptian ancestor. Privacy seals, passcodes, even blockchain security repeat ancient themes of personal access, tamper-proofing, and symbolic control. There is a philosophical wrinkle here too. Ancient locks were never foolproof. They could be picked, broken, or bypassed, exactly as ours can. Their real power was never only refusal, it was declaration. They told the world, "This is mine, and you do not have permission." That psychological line, far more than any spring or tumbler, is the true essence of security. From tombs to trade routes, from temples to ordinary homes, locks have always been about more than preventing theft. They are about control, identity, secrecy, and sometimes survival. So the next time a deadbolt slides home or a safe clicks shut, consider that you are not merely using a tool. You are carrying on a story written by kings, merchants, warriors, and priests, each of them trusting a small piece of technology to hold back the world.